Thank you. So maybe the best place to start is my own journey into doing this at all. So in my day job, I am a pediatric cardiac anesthesiologist, so I care for children and a growing population of adults who have complex congenital cardiac disease who require anesthetic care. And some months ago, I cared for a child, now actually probably about 2 years ago, I cared for a child who had a genetic syndrome that when I was in medical school and residency we were taught was universally fatal within the first year of life. Except this child was an adolescent. And the child was from a third world country, wasn't from America. Now granted, once the child presented here and we cared for the kid, there were questions about mosaicism and variable penetrance, but still it prompted this idea in my mind, since my majority funding is from the National Human Genome Research Institute looking at implementing genomic sequencing to the care of critically ill kids, of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I bring up the NHGRI work because it's a related big data field that's starting to see more and more machine learning based analytics as tools to try and provide bedside guidance for them. So this kid defied what we conventionally had thought. I'm not the first person to think of this idea of self-fulfilling prophecy. It's existed in healthcare with other sort of critically ill contexts. So it often comes up in the idea of extreme prematurity or traumatic brain injury, contexts wherein we have done very badly, where the outcome is usually quite dire, and the notion is that we collectively get a pessimistic sense about the care, and so begin to augment the care that we deliver, either explicitly or implicitly, to fulfill that prophecy. And it becomes a little bit hard to break, right? How do you become the person who knows that this particular child is the child who you can actually do better on? I began to wonder whether, in fact, these self-fulfilling prophecies would get magnified by the big data element of machine learning. When I first brought it up as an ethical issue, I brought it up to my mentors, I pitched it as a journal article, and people said, you know, that's kind of cute. Maybe it'll be something, maybe it won't be anything. It's not a particularly huge issue. We don't really see ethical concerns with machine learning or artificial intelligence being particularly important. And then close upon each other, we had the Uber Great Ball, the Volkswagen emission scandal, and the Cambridge Analytica. And all of a sudden everybody said, oh, you know, maybe in fact there are ethical considerations with artificial intelligence or algorithmic learning that we really totally underestimated. And so I want to just touch on two themes in this brief time that I have. And the ethical issues with artificial intelligence are not the artificial intelligence itself, right? An algorithm simply is an algorithm. It just does what it's supposed to do. But there are two elements to the way artificial intelligence has been implemented, and I say that modestly because the study of ethical challenges emerging with artificial intelligence to healthcare are still theoretical. They're still largely extrapolated from things that have gone wrong in non-healthcare contexts. So the two areas that seem to be provoking issues, so if you're double parked or I've already bored you and you want to leave, the first is this idea of a bad algorithm in a good world, right? So whether you want to call it values or agendas, something that is designed to do something that is in and of itself not right for the context to which it has been applied. So that would be things like Uber's Gray Ball, and I'll come back to that. But the second, which I think is the much more subtle and the much more difficult to work out, because I don't know that we actually really have the tools to study it yet, are the context into which an algorithm is placed and the ripple effects that occur from it, many unintended consequences or many unforeseen consequences. And so maybe a very extreme example of this would be what we're starting to see emerge with the Boeing MAX 737 MCAS software. It's just the failure to analyze work processes or the flow of information or the way in which people will react to an algorithm's implementation. That would be a particularly stark example. So I want to talk a little bit about the context of healthcare, and I'm going to pull at a couple threads in the course of this talk. So this is a really interesting paper by a couple of orthopedic surgeons from late last year. And what I really want to point out is just over the past 10 years, this dramatic increase in non-clinical, non-physician healthcare workers. How much a component of the healthcare workforce this administrative element has become, without actually seeing any more patients. And I also want to point out how spectacularly well paid these administrators are. This isn't meant to be a talk about the politics of salary disparities or that, but I do want to point out this issue because you have people who are being paid a great deal of money to make a lot of complex medical decisions and are trying to pursue these decisions in pursuit of things like quality performance metrics or bottom line finances for a healthcare system. I don't know that the values of such people are necessarily completely in contrast to the values of bedside clinicians, but I don't know that they always run in parallel. Healthcare in America has for a very long time existed in this state of tension between delivering healthcare for profit and delivering healthcare for absolute health at the bedside. And those two don't always run together. So this is a little bit more of the context in which healthcare is changing. This is a recent New England Journal article. It's big, it's hard to fill through, but it talks about the impact of work hours on residents. And it says the things that you have all come to know from the popular press, right? The people who work more hours are more unhappy, they're more depressed, they have a greater risk of burnout, that there are all these problems that are driving the workforce towards restricting work hours. So you have a working group that is restricting. And in fact, this has begun to reflect in actual specialties themselves once they finish residency training. So emergency medicine is a largely shift-based field. They in fact are moving towards even trying to build their shifts around circadian rhythms. My own field, anesthesia, is a shift or a call-based field, and I've only been part of 2 other institutions, but both of them, the surgical colleagues I've worked with closely, the transplant surgeons and pediatric surgeons, have also, over my time in healthcare, moved towards these shift or call-based models. So you're not having someone who is spending weeks at a time in the hospital. They come in, they do their day worth of work, and they go home. I also want to point out this element, this is a New England Journal Catalyst talk about just the rising amount of time people are spending on the electronic medical record, the EMR. It's gotten really dramatic, right? So people are having to start at 4 in the morning and working through till 10 p.m. working on their notes on this EMR. And all of that, I apologize, all of that as a thread comes together to suggest that healthcare is a little bit of a vulnerable context now, right? So if you have people that are becoming more and more shift-based workers, and if you have what is the transfer of information and the transfer of knowledge becoming this electronic medical record, then these alerts, these reminders, the algorithms that use the big data that are housed in the electronic medical record, because after all, algorithms are all about guiding the flow of information to prompt decisions or subsequent actions, they can take on an authority that perhaps they were never intended to have. Because in the transfer of care from shift to shift, what becomes the continuity is this rising electronic record and these algorithms that are asserting decisions based on the record. I want to come back to a point that I want to make now to later. There's a mathematician at Columbia, well, she was at Columbia, she's left now, Kathy O'Neill, who also talks about how unbelievably much harder it is. Now she looks at things like credit scores, Starbucks, work allocations for algorithms in society. But she has made the point and has demonstrated that it is much, much harder for an individual to rebut an algorithm's output, and you need much better data to rebut the output than often the data upon which the output was initially generated. So I put that out there. And I also want to say that I'm not against machine learning. This will sound like a pessimistic talk. I actually think that the benefits of big data are huge and are fantastic, but I want to make sure that the potential downstream consequences don't outweigh the benefits. Right now, what we're encountering is we find out about ethical transgressions because of things that occur within society, things that go wrong, like the MCAS software. We're reacting to them. What we need to do is get out in front of it and actually proactively try and study areas where there could be ethical vulnerability. It's not so easy to do, So this is IDX for diabetic retinopathy. This was approved mid last year. This is the first FDA-approved autonomous system for healthcare. It is, you need someone who basically has a high school level education. They put a patient on this machine, and the machine looks and scans the retinas to look for markers of diabetic retinopathy. But it also points out why it's been so difficult for us to get ahead of studying ethical issues, which is most of artificial intelligence technology is all occurring within the private sector right now. So it hasn't been within the academic space where it's available for scrutiny. We have a partner, I think Mike Abramoff, who designed this and is working on this, is doing a really good job of trying to anchor in terms of things like microexudates and things that clinicians already think about so that a bedside clinician can use it, but it's not so straightforward. Even decisions about setting sensitivities and specificities for this wind up having inclusion and exclusion ethical implications. Okay, so this is Kathy O'Neill talking a little bit about why it is that academic scrutiny has been hard to come by for algorithmic learning. I don't know why the slide is so big here, but she talks about there's a reluctance on the part of data scientists to doubt the objectivity of their data, and I want to come back to that in a second. There also really is a dearth of multidisciplinary scholarship. I don't know that we really yet have the anthropologic or sociologic tools to study the ethical implications of algorithms. In many ways, I think that that is probably what has happened with social media and the filtering of civic discourse through social media-based, privately owned social media-based algorithms that really blindside everybody, but it's still quite hard to tease out exactly how that works or why it creates the ripples that it creates. And then the other, which is very real, is just the financial disparity between the academic salaries for people working in technology and the salaries that they can obtain within the private sector or working in close consultation with the private sector. So this is what I was saying before. This is maybe a little outdated now. This is the Royal Free Hospital in DeepMind, but this is ethical issues. This is a little bit more a big data problem than an AI problem, but still ethical problems that have occurred with just the implementation of these private industry algorithms into the healthcare space. So this was just getting access to a huge number of people in the UK's data without appropriate privacy protections in place. And this is being raised again with Ascension right now and Google, though Google is providing the cloud service for Ascension, so it's a little bit of a gray area, but also I mentioned the caste issue, which is a similar problem. And this is Kathy O'Neill's book, which is a great read if you're interested. It's not focused on healthcare, but she talks about excuse me. She talks about algorithms in larger society. Okay, so what are issues that have come up? So a big one that has been an issue is this idea of bias. And I don't know if people know this or not. This is the Compass software. I see people nodding. This is the oft-quoted now ProPublica article in which they demonstrate that this Compass software, which was used by judges to predict recidivism of people who were being considered for their sentencing, was found to be profoundly racially biased. And the problem is the training data had baked into it racial biases, and so of course an algorithm built on those data are going to reflect the bias that's inherent to it. So this is, now I want to talk a little about the objectivity of data and some of the problems with that for healthcare. This is a standard slide that like a first-year medical student class would get in their lecture. And it's looking at sort of the causes of mortality in 1900 and the causes of mortality in 2000. So the idea of like, in 1900, this number of people died of cancer, and now in 2000, this number of people died of cancer. And it's really to talk about sort of the spectacular success, and it is a spectacular success, that is public health. But it doesn't take very long into a lecture like this before most medical students start going, how do I know that what they were calling cancer in 1900 is what I would call cancer now in 2000? That question is actually a surprisingly challenging question. I was part of a colloquium recently where we met with data scientists and epidemiologists, and for many of my data scientist colleagues, this problem of the objectivity of data was actually quite surprising. Not that these aren't very insightful, intelligent people, but rather the difficulty with gold standards in healthcare. It's much, much worse than any engineered system. Because you can imagine that trying even to clean this data would be nigh on impossible. right? Trying to find slides from 1900 to revalidate whether those cancer diagnoses were accurate, or even just the bias inherent now, because in fact, probably in 1900, they were better at diagnosing TB and syphilis than we are now, because they saw a heck of a lot more of it. So in fact, our diagnoses may be wrong now. So this absence of a gold standard, or the difficulty achieving a gold standard, winds up being a problem with healthcare and with healthcare data. This is Ginsberg's paper looking at the Framingham Risk score for cardiac risk, and this points out the problem with using racially biased data, right? So Framingham is largely a Caucasian-based population, and what this slide points out, I don't have to go through it in minute detail, but what this slide points out is that when you use it on non-Caucasian populations, it grossly overestimates and underestimates cardiac risk. It is not a reliable use when you have trained it on only one population. And it isn't inherently just a racial problem. We also have the same problem with genomes too, right? It's the same issue with the breast cancer testing too, because we don't have a full denominator of what all the variants are within society, so you only have the pretest probability of a pathologic variant in a family that has a family history of it. Okay. So people have said, well, wait a minute, if you can identify that there is disparity, why can't you correct it? Why can't you make the data more fair? Which is an interesting point. It's a little more techno-optimistic than I am. I have doubts as to whether you can in fact code for fairness, that simply demonstrating the lack of between-group difference in outcome isn't inherently fairness. Mark Cullen also wrote a very interesting editorial replying to this paper in which he pointed out that in fact another problem that I hadn't considered but that is a good one is we're changing dramatically as a society. So if you create an algorithm now in 2019, by 2029 when it's in full use, I mean Gen Y is ethnically so different from Gen X already that it's not clear that what we were defining the ethnicities 10 years before are still going to be the same thing, even if you've made those corrections. And when you put a bias, that you know about into the data, if you skew the data, you're incorporating not only your bias, but also the biases you didn't see, your unconscious biases as well, that can skew the data even worse and can create problems. I have a colleague who I collaborate with here, Nigam Shah, who points out that one of the problems that we're encountering is also that it can turn out to be a zero-sum game. That just because you can improve the outcome of one group that was disadvantaged, you wind up disadvantaging the other group that previously had a better outcome. And these are societal problems that aren't inherent to the algorithms. These are ways in which healthcare are allocated that far exceed what one algorithm can yet do. It's possible that we're just too late, that in fact we need to be providing predictive analytics much earlier in people's courses, but that too begins to move towards uncomfortably Orwellian or panopticon type states that begin to make people nervous. So enough of my digression here. Okay, so this is the bad algorithm in a good world. This is an icon for Uber's gray ball. Those of you who don't remember what that is, Uber was very aggressively trying to expand into markets that were not so receptive as the Bay Area was to them. Places like Portland, where they, or Austin in Texas, and so they came up with a predictive analytic tool to try and identify which potential users could in fact be regulators or undercover cops who were looking towards them. And the idea was that when it triggered any of a number of cascading flags, it grayed the screen to something that wasn't a real depiction of events. That it made it look like there were far fewer cars on the road, or that those cars were all in complete compliance with local regulations, rather than actually all the cars that were available to do it. From a business standpoint, it was actually probably a pretty good idea. From an ethics standpoint, right, it's really quite questionable. And this is not unique to business. As Nigam likes to say, the thing about algorithms is they're just, and big data is just going to make everything that happens bigger or more likely to happen. So you could see in a context wherein healthcare reimbursement is getting more and more hinged on compliance with a variety of quality metrics or regulatory measures, that compliance with those measures, that the pressure to have compliance with those measures might exceed the desire to always do the perfectly right thing. And that's something to be cautious about. This is another one. This is the Volkswagen emissions scandal, where Volkswagen and subsequently Audi and Porsche and stuff, they had an algorithm that knew when the car was being tested on its emissions, and it just tweaked the output so that it wasn't in pollution non-compliance when it was being tested, but was otherwise not adhering to our emission standards. Right? So same thing, avoiding regulation. This is actually a really good idea for leveraging big data that my colleague Nigam Shah has been working on, called the green button. And the idea is, if you have now access to lots and lots of big data, right, we can't do these randomized controlled trials to answer questions in a timely fashion. So why can't you leverage all the big data that you have and push the green button when you're at bedside and see how other people within this larger healthcare system are treating the kind of patient that you have, right? I mean, so you would have sort of immediate case series type report. But it gives rise to a couple ethical problems, chief of which is what I was talking about before of when does it take on an unintended authority. How many times do you push the green button before it starts to iterate itself? Which is to say, before what you're getting is no longer insightful colleagues, how they're treating the patient, but rather what it aggregately recommended you should treat the patient as, and that's what people then did. And so you keep pushing the green button and you keep iterating it. Now Nigam's working on it, but it's an obvious complex problem for integrating this big data and having an algorithm be your source of clinical guidance. This is another one that's getting worked on that's more subtle, and I want to touch on it a little bit deeper. So this is, the code part is neither here nor there. A mortality prediction algorithm. It was initially designed to be used for advanced care planning, so like palliative care, right? There's this tremendous disparity between how Americans want to die and how Americans are actually dying, right? Most people want to die at home. Most people are winding up dying in intensive care units, so that's starting to shift a little bit. So the idea being that if you have people who are presenting in a healthcare context and you can predict their 3 to 12 month mortality, you could use that as a surrogate to then recommend people to get advanced care planning, so that potentially they could begin to move down a pathway to die in compliance with their wishes. It seems like a great idea, and it is potentially a great idea. But there are a couple of challenges with it. The first is, it's designed to be disease agnostic, right? So a clinician, you make a prognosis based on, well, this person has metastatic this or heart failure that, and so you know roughly what you're thinking. Now, clinicians aren't fantastic with their ability to prognosticate, and this is not worse than clinicians, but at least it's anchored in diagnosis. So what do you do about the patients for whom this is right, but it's completely inappropriate to recommend them to palliative care? Right? So they're at very high risk of 3 to 12 month mortality because of non-accidental trauma or substance abuse overdose. How do you get these people to the right care? Right? That's ethically problematic. The second is, how do you make sure it doesn't get co-opted into unintended uses? Right? So you could see how predicting someone's likelihood of 3 to 12 month mortality, since the last year of your life is your most expensive healthcare year of life, that this would be a very powerful tool to begin to steer people away from hospital admissions or expensive care choices. And coupled to that, which is maybe the hardest, which we don't have a solution and is a problem, is that such prediction reifies the biases we were already talking about. Which is to say, even if it's predicting your 3 to 12 month mortality correctly, we have inherent in our healthcare delivery health, wealth, race disparities in the way healthcare is given. So if this predicts that someone is likely to die in the next year, they're going to get steered towards comfort care and away from aggressive therapeutic measures. Even if a significant contributor to the reason they're going to die is a health, wealth, race disparity. But it doesn't make it wrong, because giving someone aggressive chemotherapy if they only have 6 months to live is bad no matter what the reason they're going to die. But it still simply widens an already extant gap. Because it's a societal problem, it's not a problem with the algorithm, and it's not easily solved. Okay, so these are a couple of algorithm failures. I think I have about a minute here, so I may cut off in just a sec. Couple of algorithm failures that have already existed. This is Fenton's article in the New England Journal from a few years ago, looking at computer-assisted detection of breast cancer. It performed spectacularly well in the lab, like great. Everybody thought this is fantastic, it's going to help clinicians. We're looking at an area under the curve here, right? So the closer you get to 1, the better it is. What they found was when it was actually deployed, it did really badly. It did much worse than the normal standard of care. That there were far more false positives and people getting needless procedures leading to morbidities than they needed. And I think it goes back to that problem of the problem of an objective gold standard in healthcare. Right? When you're testing in the lab, you can have a gold standard that you're appealing it to. But in the real world, when the breast surgeon calls the radiologist, she says, you know, hey, look, I felt this mass in clinic, it feels something's wrong with it, can you take a double look at it? And that conveys a huge amount of information. That changes the pretest probability for the radiologist, but there's not an easy way to quantify it. And that's probably what's being reflected here, that it's a more complex environment into which we're dropping the system. Another example is the automated EKG read that occurs in every emergency room in the country. Somebody comes in and it provides an automated EKG. I don't know if any of you can read EKGs or not. This says it's sinus bradycardia. It's clearly not. This is AV block. You can see it in lead V1. And yet it still says sinus bradycardia. And this is 2017 Schlaffer's paper. They analyzed where these things were going wrong, and they came up with a laminated plaque that they felt should be put at every bedside EKG before someone used the automated system. But I would say that this is, again, a contextual problem, because a system wherein you have to read through, and these are all great ideas, but where you have to read through all of these and think about all these before you look at the automated system's output isn't really all that helpful a system. You probably would do better just reading the EKG yourself. So I think that's my speech. That's the time I've got. Thank you for letting me